Hey, DNA. Kate Wilson here with another episode of All Access DNA. In today's episode, we are talking to Dr. Emily Allen, her, a genetic researcher who specializes in Fragile X and Down syndrome. Fragile X can be a complex condition, even for folks who work in genetics, and it is associated with autism, developmental delay, movement disorders, and even premature ovarian failure. Dr. Allen shares the ways symptoms can vary, what resources are available, and where research is headed next. Let's get started. Thank you for being on the show today, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
So you work as a researcher and primarily study a condition called Fragile X, which many people I don't think have heard of. I actually had a news story that came across my feed from People magazine recently about a mom who had looked for years to get answers to her son's developmental delays and behavioral differences. And the article stated that her son was eventually diagnosed with Fragile X, but it really kind of centered on this quote from the mom about feeling guilt after getting the diagnosis, which I thought was an odd angle to take on it. But I wanted to break it down further, and we'll share a link to the article in the show notes. But maybe let's start first about what Fragile X is, the causes, why this mom or other moms may have felt some guilt, and kind of explore this a bit more, as well as some of the research that you do. So I think to start off, tell us a little bit about what Fragile X is, since, like I said, a lot of people may not be aware of it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So Fragile X syndrome is a form of intellectual disability. This particular gene, I often joke, if you can understand the genetics of Fragile X syndrome, like you're really getting a lot of the main, categories that you learn about in a general genetics class. And so with this particular gene, there's a repeated sequence. It's a CGG. So DNA is made up of 4 bases, A's and T's, C's and G's. And so there is a repeated sequence of CGGs. And everybody has this sequence. In the general population, most people have maybe 29 or 30 of these repeats, but something happens you can imagine, like when I'm trying to read a number and there's a lot of zeros in the number, like not looking at my bank account, but other things and so that you lose track of how many numbers that you're seeing. So the same thing happens, I think, with the DNA machinery when it's copying those CGG repeats, is it starts to get unstable. And so it can then, go into a little bit of this intermediate range where maybe it expands a little bit, but as it gets bigger, it gets more unstable. So those CGG repeats will go from a size which we have called pre-mutation, which I'm sure we'll talk more about in the course of this conversation, and then can expand to what the full mutation is, which causes Fragile X syndrome. So when there's more than 200 of those CGG repeats, that causes Fragile X syndrome. So what ultimately happens when there's 200 repeats, the gene is shut off and the protein isn't made, and that just impacts learning and cognition and lots of other things. And so that leads to Fragile X syndrome.
Yeah, and it is one of those ones that's a little tricky because there's a few different things happening with the condition. It's not a simple, there's like that one change, like you talked about with like the repeat. What drew you to being a researcher in this area and to studying Fragile X?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk about this. I work with high school kids a lot and just talking about figuring out what you want to be when you grow up. Because when I was in school, if you liked science, like, okay, you go to med school and that's really, so I was going to be a pediatrician and blah, blah, blah. And then at some point during college, I worked in a lab and I was like, wait, this is great. I don't have to talk to people all the time. I can just like do my own thing. Like for an introvert, this was a great thing. And then the class that I just really enjoyed the most in college was my genetics class. And so I applied to graduate school to just do research because I wanted to do research. And so then the way our program worked for graduate school is you rotate through 3 different labs, and everybody who started graduate school together in our genetics program, they were all going to work on cancer. That was the plan. Everybody's going to do cancer. And then you rotate through different labs, and it's not just the topic of the lab, but it's also the people you're going to be working with. And what I figured out is I actually really like math a lot too. So I do a lot more of like epidemiological studies, working with families and understanding numbers and stuff like that. And so the third rotation I did, I worked with my mentor, Dr. Stephanie Sherman, and she's one of my favorite humans in the world. And so she worked on Fragile X syndrome and Down syndrome. And so that's what I worked on. And then, once you get in the field and you work with the families, I think you just get really invested. And so now I've been doing it for 25 plus years.
Why do you think a lot of people are unfamiliar with Fragile X? Because it's associated with developmental delays. It can be associated with autism. But like I said, I think, and you mentioned working with families with Down syndrome. That one seems to be more common that people have heard about, but not so much Fragile
Yeah.
X.
Yeah. And I definitely, anytime someone asks about my research, I'm like, I work on Down syndrome and Fragile X syndrome, which is another form of intellectual disability. So I do, I feel the same way that the general public, has a better understanding of Down syndrome. Um, I don't know really. Like, I think that there's definitely some issues with the delays in getting a diagnosis with Fragile X syndrome, and it also just the inheritance pattern and relying on families to talk to each other and communicate the risk is different than in Down syndrome, because in Down syndrome it is it's a random occurrence that happens. It's not a that we know this gene is being passed through the family. So there's definitely some um, things that we've heard from families of, even at a cultural level, like we don't talk about things like that. And so if there is an individual with developmental delay or intellectual disabilities, like there's this issue of the blame. And like some of the families have been, once they start trying to talk to their extended family, those family members are like, well, it couldn't have come from us. It's not us. And so I think that communication within families is one area where we struggle sometimes. There are other families that are very, like, we talk about every single pregnancy and like everything going on, but that's not always the case. But also, our clinicians are not necessarily doing the testing that they should do when a person comes to the clinics, not just for individuals with Fragile X syndrome, but the individuals with the pre-mutation are at risk for other conditions. And there are guidelines that exist. And so, for example, women with the pre-mutation form of the gene, which is 55 to 200 repeats, the women are at increased risk for going through menopause early. So this is Fragile X, premature ovarian insufficiency, or FAXPOI. And so if a woman comes in with fertility issues to their OBGYN or their reproductive endocrinologist, they should have the genetic testing done for the FMR1 gene. And we know from the surveys we've done with clinicians that testing isn't being done. And so I think there's just a good amount of disconnect between general clinicians and the geneticists, and like that they're not, fully communicating and making sure that the testing that needs to be done is being done.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and so I wanna back up a little bit with, like, the genetics of Fragile X. So you mentioned there's a gene, the
Mm.
FMR1 gene, and I am digging back into the recesses of my mind from grad school and some of this because this was not an area I worked in. And instead of it being just like a single change that basically says, "This gene works, this gene doesn't," it is this repeat that makes it more unstable, kind of the I kinda think about it when you're pulling, like, slime apart, right? And it gets very thin, right? And you can break
Yeah,
that string. It's sort of like that. The longer these repeats go, the more unstable or fragile it
yeah,
gets. And so you had mentioned that there's a certain number of repeats that then either says, yes, this is a mutation in FMR1 and now it's not working the way it's supposed to. Or there can be a certain number of repeats where it's what's called a pre-mutation. So meaning that somebody is a carrier. So can you tell us a little bit more what that means, like to be a pre-mutation or to carry that
right.
pre-mutation?
Yeah. And so the term carrier, right, that like in the field of genetics typically means you carry a version of the gene, but you are not affected. And so that is not what ends up being the case for families with Fragile X. And so with the premutation carrier, for many years, we did think, okay, individuals with a premutation are not affected. They are carriers, but we know the inheritance pattern. So we know this mom must have the gene, must have the expanded repeat, but will not be affected. But as these family conferences started happening, and this is just, like moms can just get some stuff done, obviously. And so like the moms are sitting together at a conference and one woman is saying like, oh, I'm having hot flashes. I go to my doctor. My doctor's like, you're way too young for this. This can't be like something else must be going on. And another mom is like, whoa, weird. Me too. And so just moms talking to each other at a conference many years ago, all of the researchers then went back and like did little surveys through the mail or over the telephone, found out that yes, women with the pre-mutation are at increased risk for an earlier age at menopause. And it's about 20% of women with the pre-mutation will be diagnosed with FAX boys. So that's menopause before age 40. So that's 10 years earlier than what you see in the general population. And so that was the first one that was described, the first characteristic of pre-mutations. And then there have been additional things that have been described in the literature. We really like our acronyms in the field. So there's FAX-TAS, tremor ataxia syndrome. So that's seen um, in older males. About 40% of males with the pre-mutation will have this late onset neurodegenerative condition. And this one was also like families coming into the clinic. And this was at UC Davis, the Mind Institute, Dr. Rondi Hagerman was seeing families. And when they would come in, moms, we talked to mom and she's talking about her dad who's starting to have issues, or the dad might come into the clinic also and they see him and, what's going on with him. And so then Louise Gain was the genetic counselor out there. And so they then started talking to families and said, okay, well, now this seems like another thing that's going on among people who have the pre-mutation allele. And so again, that's more common in males, but it is seen in some females as well. And then we also see neuropsychiatric conditions. So a lot of depression and anxiety. In our population of women that we've recruited, it's somewhere between 30 and 40% of women with the pre-mutation report having anxiety and depression. And so we do a lot of work related to that, trying to understand that more, if that's something that's more environmental, like you're taking care of a kid with Fragile X syndrome, you have other things going on, or if that is, that they are genetically susceptible to this increased frequency of anxiety and depression.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too, as somebody who's been in the field for 20 years, to see how some of these pre-mutation things have come about and described because, um, at another point in time, well, we didn't know that these were things that were potentially associated with it.
Right.
And one thing I also wanna make sure that listeners understand is in terms of thinking about the X chromosome. So why we're talking about kind of the differences between a pre-mutation carrier who is, female at birth and a pre-mutation carrier who's male assigned at birth. And the X chromosome is typically the chromosome that is given by the mom, parent, and then you have the Y that typically comes from the father. So if again, we're just gonna kind of speak in more generalities, XX is typically somebody assigned female at birth, XY is somebody typically assigned male at birth. We do know that sex chromosomes are much more complex than that, and it's not the only thing, right, that determines biological sex. But since Fragile X the FMR1 gene is on the X chromosome, and we typically can see that pass from mother to son, is that why we see mostly males affected with the full mutation or the Fragile X syndrome?
Yeah. So with males, like you're saying, they don't have a backup copy, right? So that if a male inherits that full mutation, they typically have Fragile X syndrome. There can be a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, if they inherit the full mutation from their mom, then they will have Fragile X syndrome. For females who inherit that, they can inherit the full mutation version of the X chromosome, but then they also will get another X chromosome from their father. And so with that, what we know is the X inactivation occurs. So within each cell in the body, one of the X chromosomes is randomly inactivated. And that is, we call that the X inactivation ratio. And so how much of female is affected by Fragile X syndrome will vary based on that X inactivation ratio. So if the full mutation, the one with the expanded repeat, is active more of the time, then they will have more of the characteristics of Fragile X syndrome. Whereas if it's skewed in the other direction and their copy of the X chromosome that has like 30 repeats is active most of the time, then they will be less affected. And so we know that from studies probably even before my time of it, that we can see that relationship in girls with the full mutation.
That's also why you were alluded to the fact, like, if you really understand Fragile X, then you're understanding a
Yeah,
lot of different
yeah,
types of, like,
yeah,
mechanisms behind the scenes, and I will also say this is one where even when I taught medical genetics to med students, every time we would get to X chromosome, Fragile X, it was, like, mind blown with, like, half the folks, I think, in the class because it's like
yeah. I mean, and it just continues to get more complicated. Like that's I
yeah,
start to say little things of like, oh, but it really expands mostly when it comes from mom, but not from dad. It's like it. There's tons of work that exists out there in the field, but we don't need to get into all the details
yeah.
today.
Well, and I think part of the reason I wanna bring it up is because I think my guess is this is why that article and people was, like, focused on this, like, mom guilt, which
Yeah,
again, I don't mean to downplay in terms of I'm sure that the mom was experiencing that, and I can't even imagine, getting a diagnosis and then learning that it was inherited, through my genetics. I think more I just was interested in the fact that the People magazine, like, made that the headline.
hmm,
But I'm wondering, if that's partly why there is some of that feelings like, we can't control what chromosomes that we're passing. We don't really have any say in it, but it is also understandable for I think any parent to want the best for their child and to want to give their child everything that they can. So I was
yeah.
wondering, is that something that you see in working with families with Fragile X is kind of this I guess adaption or processing in how genes are passed along through families?
Yeah, I mean, I I don't have the opportunity very often of, like, meeting a newly diagnosed family, so I don't I mean, like, I talked about it with some families and stuff, and like, it's all in your family dynamics and stuff too. I think, you have to think about, like, yeah, you may have passed on a gene that you're not happy about, but you also passed on good traits, right? Like there's also other things and so it is a hard thing, I'm sure, to deal with. I'm a big advocate too of like with the genetic counseling for these families. Like I think, you have that initial diagnosis where you find out, yes, you gave this gene to your son who might be affected with Fragile X, but there's again, I mean, we've already talked about there's so much else going on. You might be at increased risk for infertility or, all of these other things and talking to the rest of your family. But it's so much to take in that first visit of, the genetics of Fragile X and what this is going to look like for your kid and stuff that there needs to be an ongoing relationship with that genetic counselor because there's going to come a time when you're ready to talk about yourself and your health needs, but that definitely takes a while because your kid is really your focus. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So,
Right, and like we've been talking about, like, the genetics, the mechanisms behind it is complex, and at that point, your focus is on your child, right?
yeah.
So I think that's
Yeah.
that's an important call out is that there's ongoing relationships that these families and that these patients form with, not just, like, their medical team, but with folks like yourself and people that work in the advocacy space and the researchers that work in this space in terms of really building those relationships and kind
Yeah.
of that ongoing engagement. One question I had too is so how does Fragile X actually overlap with autism or ADHD or some of these more partly developmental delay, but also like behavioral types
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
things?
So I I think the estimate is around 50% of males with Fragile X syndrome will have a dual diagnosis of autism.
Mm,
And there are a lot of similar characteristics. And I've been in meetings before, where researchers in all of their infinite wisdom, like are talking about, like, what does it matter? Like, they're already diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome. Why do we need an autism diagnosis? And then somebody else argues, well, to get services, like if you have that diagnosis that will help with, all the things you need for school and the IEPs and I don't know, all of the different things that you need to get done. And again, like you said, that Fragile X syndrome isn't as well known. So if you can, approach some of these spaces with something that's more readily understood, I think that is gonna help facilitate getting the right services for your kid.
mhm, mhm. What are some things that you wish like the public or maybe even teachers or doctors or maybe some of this is what the families have shared with you? Like, what do they wish that folks understood better about Fragile X?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna draw on both my Fragile X and Down syndrome work for this one because I've been doing a lot with a Down syndrome project where we're working with community advisory boards and making sure that when we're inviting individuals to participate in research, for example, that we're really meeting them where they are and providing all the resources they need. And I think that's true of any project of just being flexible, having clear expectations and really describing what it is that you're asking someone to do, whether it be research or in a classroom or something like that. Like just having schedules and clear expectations and clear guidelines. For example, with our Down syndrome project, we have created this social story thing. So, what it is like, oh, you're coming in for a research project. Here's a picture of all the people you're going to meet that day. Like, this person will do this part of the study. This person here's the when you walk in, here's what it's gonna look like, which I feel like I would love to have for everything I do in my life. Like, anytime I have to go to the doctor, like, "Yes, you've walked into the right place. Now go talk to this person," and just really giving clear information and pictures of everything that they're gonna see so that they can think about it ahead of time and process it more and that you're not just like bombarding them in the moment with a lot of information. And so I mean, I think that's just true across the board that you have to have flexibility, recognize when something isn't working and that you're overstimulating someone that you're and there's a lot of anxiety and things like that in this population. So just making sure you're sensitive to that and you back off when you need to and again, just really communicate what it is you're trying to achieve or
Hmm.
asking them to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's very helpful as well. And I love the idea of being very upfront with like, here's what's going to happen, but also here's who you're going to see. And so there's that giving of the information, but that visual element as well that helps folks.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, not everybody follows the auditory instructions. So having the pictures and like a clear calendar of like this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen.
What are some of the, I guess, signs or things that people might see that would lead a family to seek testing for Fragile X? Because you mentioned there was like criteria in terms of like diagnosing somebody with Fragile X or ordering testing for Fragile X. So, and
Yeah.
we've talked about a lot of variability with this condition. So, what are some of the things that people would notice, I suppose, that would then have them seek out this type of testing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the majority of our families are identified because of an individual with Fragile X syndrome. So somebody who is diagnosed with developmental delay in childhood, and so then we will like work with the family and do genetic testing on all of the individuals so we can track which side of the family does. But that's not the only way we identify families. As I mentioned, there's the early menopause that's seen in women. And so we work with an amazing reproductive endocrinologist here at Emory, Dr. Heather Hitt. And so she did her fellowship project with us on FaxBoy. And so she's is very great at like identifying individuals who might be at risk. And so she had one woman in particular that I love the story came into her it works for a great company with great health insurance, and she wanted to freeze her eggs. And Heather was like, "Okay, cool. Yes, great. Let's just talk about your periods. Are they very regular?" And she's like, "No, they're not, but it's fine. They never have been." And Heather's like, "Wait a minute. Let's dig into that a little bit more." And so just that's the other way that we have identified some families is as women have problems with infertility. As I mentioned, the guidelines are that they should be tested for the expanded pre-mutation repeat. And so that's kind of one of the, like again, so you can see intellectual disabilities, but also changes in reproductive. I'm trying so hard not to use the word phenotype, but reproductive issues in women and stuff. But then also that tremor ataxia syndrome. So if like you're seeing some of these different things track in a family, that would be a good, indication that maybe we should do some genetic testing.
Right, because it could be showing up in different generations or different parts of the
Right.
family, and it's not all gonna look the same in the same family.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
One thing I did wanna know a little bit more about is just kind of current research today with, like, Fragile X. So, what are some of the things with Fragile X that you or maybe some of your colleagues are trying to understand better in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the condition.
Yeah. I mean, so just to throw out another one of those, if you understand Fragile X, you understand all of genetics, is reduced penetrance. So not everybody, like not all of the women with a pre-mutation go through menopause early, 20% do. So trying to understand what's that difference. And so some of the things we've done is just whole genome sequencing. Are there other genes that might be playing a role in age at menopause? And then one of the things I'm currently interested in working on is looking at environmental risk factors. So if where you live or jobs that you've had, if those kind of things impact your risk for going through menopause earlier, like if you've been exposed to different chemicals and stuff like that. But I will say too, like in the field of Fragile X syndrome of the full mutation, there's been a lot of work. I mean, obviously, people are focused on trying to find treatments and things like that. And there have been multiple clinical trials that have happened the last few years. I will say a lot of stuff that looked really good in mouse models has not worked quite as well in the human clinical trials. As one of the parents said at one point, it's a great time to be a Fragile X mouse, but not so great for the humans. But we also have, which I will describe this, and it goes somewhere between this is so cool to this could be potentially creepy to some people, but we have the ability to, we can take either a blood sample or a urine sample from an individual and turn those into induced pluripotent stem cells, so iPSCs. And what we can do with those cells is tell them, hey, I want you to become neurons, or hey, I want you to, we can give it different signals to tell it what kind of cell to become. And so we actually have people here at Emory and other places, other researchers that have done this. And you can push these cells to become almost like mini brains in a dish. They're called organoids. And so, yeah, it's a little creepy, but you can take actual cells from patients, so an individual with Fragile X syndrome, grow the cells in a dish. Then these organoids or mini brains can be used to test treatment. So we can look at first, how is a Fragile X organoid different from someone without the full mutation? And so if we then treat with different drugs, can we then rescue some of the differences? And so that's really cool stuff that's going on. And I think has really high potential for identifying treatment options. Again, it's a little, we had a high school student a few years ago who presented on these organoids and like talking about the like just ethical, like how far can you
Mhm.
push this? Like, can we eventually get to the point where we make all of the different organs and can we make a person?
Right.
And so like it is a little, I don't know, a little disconcerting, but it's also like it's a much better model than mice, right? I mean, like mice,
Mm.
still we can do behavioral assays and stuff like that. So they do have a place in research, but being able to use actual human cells to test things is really going to help move the field forward, I feel like.
Mhm. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and I think you were talking about earlier, like, there's some things that you find work in different types of animal models or even theoretical models, right? Because sometimes we'll run things through, like, algorithm, software system types of things, but until you try it with, like, human cells,
Yeah.
there's so much variability, in our
Hmm.
genome, to then
Yeah.
try to figure out what's gonna be going on. So it's fascinating. I think it's like a lot of innovations I hear in the genetic space where I'm like, it's intriguing, but also terrifying.
Right. I feel like we're going to have some movie one day.
Exactly. There's some different ways it'll go.
And then they pushed it too far.
Exactly, exactly. One thing that I was curious about too is your work with families with Fragile X or with Down syndrome. How has that been in terms of like shaping your research? I don't necessarily know if it's like methodologies or study designs or
Yeah.
just kind of how you communicate about your research findings. Like, how does that play a part in it? Because one thing I don't know if the general public probably understands is that sometimes as a researcher, whether you want to be or not, sometimes you can get yourself somewhat removed from the community or the groups that you're trying to help.
Yeah.
So how do you utilize that engagement, that feedback, that those discussions, those relationships in terms of your research?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. Like, I love talking about women and moms and fax ploy and stuff. So, for the women, like, we've been doing this reproductive survey on women with a premutation for years since I started grad school. And I analyze that data. That's what I love to do is statistics and all of that stuff. So like, I figure out what their age of menopause was and I run all the models and look at all of that. And then I've had genetic counseling students that have started working with me. And one of them was like, I'm going to do qualitative interviews with women who went through menopause early. And I was like, cool. Yeah. Okay. Great. She says, do you want to be the second scorer? I was like, totally. Yeah. Whatever. I'll read them. But what a mind blowing thing to hear the stories that these women have of having to go to 4 different doctors until somebody finally listened to them. It just like where I've been using a data point, like there's a whole story behind each one of those little data points, and how hard these women have to advocate to just get good health care, like to have someone listen to them. Like the one woman who did visit the 4 doctors, when was it the college age when she started having symptoms, went to her doctor and her doctor said, "You're just stressed out. Here's some anxiety meds." And so she knew that wasn't the case. So she went to another doctor. Me, I would have, that first doctor would have said that and been like, okay, all right, you're right. That's probably it. And so it concerns me that, like, really we're probably missing so many people because if you're not that person who's gonna push to get all the diagnosis and stuff to get a doctor to listen to you, then not gonna get that information. But it really is just, like, such, like, it brings meaning to all the work that we do working with the families. Like, every other year, there's a family conference for Fragile X that I go to, and I've always taken my family with me too because I want them to see the work that I do and meet the families and stuff. One of my favorite like moments from one of the conferences was when shy Julia was like sitting over playing on an iPad and a guy with Fragile X comes and sits beside her and they're just coloring together. And I was just like, this is great, connecting with the families. And with the Down syndrome project, just from the very beginning of that project, we've, been working with the community advisory boards. I just hosted a panel last week of 3 self advocates with Down syndrome, all in their 20s. And that was a blast. It was
Mhm.
very entertaining. And so, like just making sure that you're hearing the families and what they need. And you're not just doing research for what you in your like ivory tower think should be done, like the research you think is important, but making sure you're hearing from the families what their top priorities are and giving back to them also, like providing resources back to them, I think is really important.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually chatting with somebody else earlier today, and we were talking about, the community engaged research, and patient engaged research. And we were talking about the importance of like even hopefully being able to return findings, to those families that participate in the research, because sometimes that's not a blanket thing that happens across
Yeah.
the board. And then I love what you said too about it really puts the person at the data point. So instead of like
Yeah.
seeing all
Yeah.
these like aggregated data together, you're thinking about this specific person that you met at one of the conferences, which
Yeah.
I think is so important and something that can be easy to kind of forget if you're
Mhm.
buried within just all the data that there are people behind the data.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've covered, honestly, quite a long wide range of things, and I feel like there's so much more we could get into with Fragile X, as well as Down syndrome and some of your work that you've been doing. But if there's one thing that folks would to take away from our conversation today, like, what's the one thing you hope that they remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think just thinking about your point about the guilt and the like why it's not as well known. Like it just I guess my emphasis would be for like people to really advocate for themselves and like if you know your kid and if you feel like you're not getting the services you want, keep pushing until you find the doctor that listens to you or the services that you need, the people that help you along the way. Because I get that it's a frustrating infrastructure with all of the insurance issues and everything else that exists out in the world. But like the best thing you can do is just keep pushing and trying to get all of the services and talking to your community to see what other things exist out there because I do think that that's what a lot of our families end up reporting back to us is just like so for example the individuals that have like anxiety and depression and like just going to a therapist is great, but also talking to other moms of kids with Fragile X who are suffering from anxiety and depression. Have somebody, representation matters. So having somebody that's in the same space as you that you can share your experiences with, I think is really important as well. So I don't think I gave a very distinct or direct answer to that, but it's just, like finding what it is you need and being flexible until you feel supported.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know, like, that there are these things potentially out there, and it can be frustrating and it can be
Uh-huh.
exhausting to continue to do it, but that there are people that are supportive of you continuing to do it and that it's okay
Yeah.
to advocate for
Yeah.
yourself.
And yeah, like I'll share the resources with you, but like the National Fragile X Foundation website has so many, like just like even one pagers you can take to your doctor and be like, hey, here's what I need you to know about me and my genetics, and like now pay attention to me and help me out here. So yeah,
Perfect. I was gonna ask, I was like, if you can send us some resources, I'll put
yeah,
those as well in the show notes so folks can find some of that information and see where some of these communities hang out online, because that is one nice thing is that there's a lot more online spaces
yeah,
now for a lot
yeah.
of folks to connect. Emily, I very much appreciate you being on and sharing, I think your passion for working in this space and then your love for genetics and research. So just thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
For more information about this episode, visit allaccessdna.podbean.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. This link is also in the show notes for easy access. Any inquiries on the podcast can be sent to allaccessdna@gmail.com. Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/allaccessdna and consider donating to get bonus content, submit questions for our guests, and connect with other genetic curious individuals. Note that this podcast is for entertainment and education and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult your physician with any questions you may have regarding your health. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This helps other people like you discover the show. All Access DNA is hosted, produced, and edited by Kate Wilson. The logo design is by Designs by NKJ. Thanks for listening and join us next time.